shout out and let them know how much you appreciate them. Just a little bit of a couple of updates. At a personal level, Danelle's doing really well after her hip replacement surgery, and we appreciate all the cards and messages and stuff. I'm reminded of the value of notes like Miss Lee Manuel has done for so many years. And so be sure and reach out to all the folks and encourage them as you can during this time. I hope you're finding enough to keep you occupied. I did an EEM video here not long ago for as a board member, and talked about the encouragement I'm getting from all the examples of acts of kindness going on in the areas now. One of my buddies sent me a little tee-hee the other day. I thought I'd share it with you. She wrote, "I hope you're finding enough to keep yourself occupied. The weather should be good tomorrow as I begin my trip to Puerto Backyardo. I have had all the fun I can stand at Los Living Room." So that may be where all of us are. I drove through Landa Park a while ago, 64 degrees, and you could count the number of people on your fingers and toes. Well, I might not because I don't have all my toes anymore, but there wasn't many folks. A great time to be out. I want to give you a roof update before we begin the lesson. Mr. Joe Turner and I have been working on that with Victor's help, and the soffit and the fascia has been worked on, painted, and repaired. We've got the roofers have got the old gravel and rock and tar and stuff off the roof, so it's pretty naked right now. They probably will discover this next week what kind of moisture is below the decking with an imaging work that we had done this last week. And if you drive by Monday or Tuesday, you should see the new material being delivered here on the church campus out in the parking lot, and we'll begin the laydown of the roof as we're going. So no surprises so far. Just wanted everybody to know what's going on. Today's talk is about the battles of David. It comes primarily from 2 Samuel chapters 10 and Psalms 20 and 21, which is in line with what we were doing in our lessons here lately. The term battle, at least as I read it in my dictionary, is to engage in combat one-on-one or in larger groups. It is a struggle to succeed or to survive. So whether you're talking about battling as a team in sports or battling an illness or disease like we find ourselves in now, it's been an experience that has been long going for all of us. Victor was kind enough to put together a little map for you. Being an old ranch broker from South Texas, I like to have some kind of orientation, and while I'm much more comfortable talking about jumping the creek by the big pear over by the Crooked Mesquite versus GPS and all that other stuff, you can see from the map, hopefully, that we kind of used as the epicenter of Jerusalem, and then the different battles that we'll be talking about today. To give you a perspective of this, Damascus is about 200 miles, 325 kilometers, or 200 miles sort of northeast of Jerusalem. To give us an idea here, New Braunfels to Dallas is about 243 miles. So it's less than here to Dallas to this distance past. And as you can see, surrounding much closer to Jerusalem are all of the tribes, the groups that we'll be speaking with about today. So it's pretty close battles. Those people got in each other's space pretty regular in terms of the context of what's going on. Now, King David had many battles, and you just kind of have to pick and choose which ones to use. So I made the choice to address the ones of the people that you see on that map today. But there's just way too much to cover in a single class, so we're picking and choosing a little bit of that, and likely that decision making is based on my flawed approach to it. But our reference I'd like to begin with is 1 Samuel 30, verses 7 and 8, and in there they talk about David seeking the ephod. I don't know, E-P-H-O-D, ephod. English is the only foreign language I know, so I'm not very good with those old languages. But this ephod had a Urim, U-R-I-M, and a Thummim, T-H-U-M-M-I-M. I won't be spelling much today, but it's sewed onto the breastplate, and This ephod was a garment of fine linen worn by the high priest, and I look at it as kind of a forecasting tool used to make important decisions, like whether or not to go to war or join alliances with other nations. And again, the reference is 1 Samuel 30, 7 and 8. And in that case, David used that to speak with the Lord to make those decisions. The first group I'd like to share with you is the Ammonites. And that's the reference that you find in 2 Samuel. The Ammonites are kind of northeast neighbors, if you want to consider that, looking at that map a little bit. And there was a king named Nahash that had passed away, and David sent condolences to his heir Hanan. Now, I'm really not sure why he did that, because in 1 Samuel we have a record where Nahash wanted to put the right eye out of the people at Jabesh that he was about to capture. So, as you might expect, Hanan was kind of suspicious about what David's motivations were here, and he disrespected the emissaries that David had sent in a very insulting way. The scripture says that he shaved off half their beards and cut off their cloaks. Basically, as you might remember, this culture valued a full and long beard, and they wore robes. So what they did was cut the back of their robes off to buttocks level, it says, and shaved half their beards. Now, I don't know if they shaved it right to left or up and down, but irrespective, this was a very terrible insult for people in this time, in this culture. That was equal to flogging and branding an emissary. So, as you might imagine, this did not do David, did not sit well with David, and he told the folks to stay away and let their beard grow out, and he mounted up an army to attack the Ammonites. Now, one of the wonderful things about trying to be a teacher and share things with folks is you get to dig a little bit deeper than you might otherwise in reading stuff. And so what I came to find out was that David had 12 divisions to his army. That's equal to the 12 tribes, and each of the tribes were to enlist 24,000 men, and they served 1 month a year on a rotating basis unless they were called to arms. So David basically had 286,000 soldiers available to him in case of an emergency. We can understand states of emergency right now in our world. Now, in reading through the reference point of 2 Samuel 10, Nahash went out and hired about 53,000 men. So even illiterate cowboy Bohemian Aggie doctor can see that the ratio is better than 5-to-1 in favor of David, and so that really ended up not being too much of a contest. But this particular battle was because of the insult David felt given how the son Hanan had responded to his invitation of condolences. So best intentions went bad. The next group of folks that are referenced here are some people called the Moabites. These are kind of folks pretty much straight east of Jerusalem, and this is really a long-standing conflict with Israel. This group was, the founder was Moab. Now, if you know this ITES, there's all kinds of ITESs. And Moab was the son of Lot and his daughter. You might recall that when Lot fled, he and his daughter went with him, and of course his wife was the pillar of salt. But Moab was the product of this relationship that Lot had with one of his daughters. And it's important for you to remember that Ruth came from Moab. You might remember Ruth and Boaz is a really great story in and of itself. We have a whole chapter about that. And they had a son named Obed, who had a son named Jesse, who had David. So David's great-grandma was a Moabite. I've studied bloodlines a long time in my life for deer and horses and stuff, but this one's pretty easy to follow. And in fact, I'm gonna reference a couple of these where they talk about that. 2 Samuel 8 and 2 Kings 3 are both reference points for this. And the 2 Kings 3 has a really disturbing story in that the Moabite ruler sacrificed his eldest son, which was the future ruler, on the wall as the Israelites besieged the city. Now the context of that particular victory for David was that there were 1,000 chariots destroyed, 700 horsemen destroyed, and over 20,000 foot soldiers. So by anybody's standards, that's a pretty big battle. And again, only one of many that David was involved with. Another of the groups that David took a look at in terms of battling was the Edomites. And the Edomites were descendants of Esau, the older twin brother of Jacob, who of course they were the sons of Isaac. And Edomites' capital was known as Seir, S-E-I-R, or Bozrak, B-O-Z-R-A-C-K, and eventually it was known as Selah. Today we would call it Petra. Now they're kind of southeast of Jerusalem. You might remember that it was prophesied that the older son would be ruled by the younger. And you might remember from your early studies, if not your later ones, that the soup incident's trickery created the bitter hatred between the brothers and their tribes. So even though Israel was ordered not to hate the Edomites, since they were related, many wars were fought between those nations. And that one I'd like to actually quote because I found it particularly interesting. If you want to, turn over to Deuteronomy 23:7, and we'll take a look at that. Deuteronomy 23:7. And in my Bible it says, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother's. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were an alien in his land. The children of the third generation born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord." So again, we had commandments instructions to get along with those folks, but the group didn't follow it very well. Now, being a ranch broker and involved in soils and things, I found it interesting that the country of Edom was kind of a red stone landscape. Donnell's from western Oklahoma, and they talk about that kind of stuff as red rock country. And Edom in the Semitic word means red, and you might recall that Esau was described as a hairy man, reddish in color. One of the other interesting facts about this area was there was a key travel route in ancient times that ran through Edom and was called the King's Highway, and Jacob's tribe was not allowed to use it. So this is again a different example of territorial issues, and that's found in Numbers 20, verse 17 through 20, and I'd like to share that one with you because that's pretty interesting even today in terms of travel routes. So Numbers 20, verses 17 through 20. My Bible says, well, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. It's 14 through 20. Now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. "Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardships that's befallen us, how your fathers went down to Egypt, and we dwelt in Egypt a long time. And the Egyptians afflicted us and our fathers. When we cried out to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent the angel and brought us up out of Egypt. Now here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your border." So that's kind of the background. And then the request starts in verse 17. "Please let us pass through your country. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, nor will we drink water from wells. We will go along the King's Highway. We will not turn aside to the right hand or the left hand until we pass through your country. So basically, all they're asking for is access. They don't plan to pillage or take any of the produce, the water, any of the resources. But then Edom said to him, you shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with the sword. So he said no in a pretty tough way. My granddad had a sign on his front porch that said, this place is guarded by 2 mean cow dogs and a shotgun, so enter at your own risk. So that's kind of what this was said to the Israelites. So verse 19 says, so the children of Israel said to him, we'll go by the highway, and if I or my livestock drink any of your water, then I will pay you for it. Let me only pass through on foot, nothing more. So it's pretty minimal request. Then he said, you shall not pass through. So Edom came out against them with many men and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory. So Israel turned away from him. So they couldn't fight them. They were, refugees basically fleeing from Egypt. And you might imagine that would be something that would be hard felt for very many long years. So I just thought that was particularly interesting because so much of this in here deals with territory issues, issues of resources and control. So that's the Edomites. The very first tribe that the group of Israel fought with was the Amalekites. And the Amalekites were kind of neighbors to the southwest from Jerusalem. And Israel fought with them right after crossing the Red Sea. And God promised to wipe them away from the face of the earth and announced there'd be many wars between the two tribes. And my reference points for that would be Exodus 17, Judges 3, and chapter 3 and chapter 6. Now, this particular tribe should have been completely eliminated by Saul if he had followed God's orders in 1 Samuel 15. And almost all of them were killed by David in 1 Samuel 30. Now, you might remember from your Sunday school lessons that Saul kept some of the prized livestock and stuff, and this began basically his God's turning away from him and not allowing him to become to stay any longer the ruler, and David then became heir apparent. Now, they were ultimately lost from the nations on earth. 1 Chronicles chapter 4 reference that as punishment for rebellion against God and his people. So back in this time, this was also when Moses struck the rock and he held his hand up in battle. You may remember that, and he got so tired that people had to help hold his hands up. So this Amalekites were also the folks that took David's wives, 2 wives, and then he went and found them. So this was some pretty bitter rivalry with this folks, and they're long-standing conflicts. But ultimately, recall that they were completely eradicated, which was for their failure to honor the folks. So those particular groups of people represent some of the more important ones, I guess, some of the ones I've chosen to visit with you about, but by far and away, the most significant number of people that the Israelites would battle with would be the Philistines. And they were pretty much neighbors to the west that kind of bordered them in the Mediterranean Sea. And I guess the Philistines had no other direction to go except north and east, because they would run into the Amalekites if they went south. So you might remember one of the most epic battles of the Philistines, and that was, of course, when David took on Goliath. And there are many other references to that. But Philistia is one of the oldest nations on record compared to the other tribes in David's day. Some of the records go back to 1100 BC. And just like most of the other people that Israel fought about, the main problem was one of control. Control of land, crops, taxes, payments, water, all of it amounted to the same thing: who's in charge. Of course, we kind of know who's in charge with the benefit of 2020 long-term vision, but in truth, we'll speak a little bit more about who's in charge a little later. So this tribe comes from Noah's son Ham, and that's found in Genesis 10. And Isaac and Abraham dealt with them in Canaan, referenced in Genesis 21. And their fate was sealed even back in Exodus 23, but they continued to be problematic in Saul's and David's time. There are several battle references with this particular group. 1 Samuel chapters 4, 7, 14, and 31, and 2 Chronicles 28, and 2 Kings 18. So lots of stories about this particular group. It strikes me that what was occurring here was the references and storylines, examples of people not being able to get along, people in conflict. Sound familiar today even in our world. And so now, kind of in typical Aggie fashion, before we kind of bring a close to this, I want to go back and read the story after you've kind of heard an overview of what our main thrust was today. And so we're going to start with Psalms 20 and 21. I'm not going to read all of that, but there's a couple of key points in there that I think have a great deal of value. So bear with me while I get over to that, and you might want to look it up on your Bible or on your phone. So when we take a look at Psalm 20, what I really want you to focus on, if you will, is in Psalm 20, starting with chapter 7. It says, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. They have bowed down and fallen, but we have risen and stand upright. May the King answer us when we call. Save, Lord." And in 21, it says, "The King shall have joy in your strength, O Lord." And then it continues to talk about the blessings that come along with that. And in verse 6, it says, "You have made him exceedingly glad with your presence." 7 says, "For the King trusts in the Lord, and through the mercy of the Most High we shall be moved." If you skip down to 11, it says, "For they intended evil against you, they devised a plot which they are not able to perform." These references, I think, are particularly important because if the opportunity presents itself for me to speak again, I want to talk about when David forgot all this and did some things that he probably shouldn't have done, kind of refocusing his attention away from God and from the benefit of being with Him and living with Him and following His lead. Now, 2 Samuel 10, which was a reference point for this, if you'll turn back over to that if you want to, we'll take a look at a couple things there. And in this one is the story that I referenced early and kind of the overview about how he treated the people that David had sent and the ramifications of that as it went along in terms of what they were doing. The consequences of this was that these people were made to serve Israel, and the other people were afraid to help the folks because they could see that God was on their side. As I kind of move into some kind of concluding remarks here, I realize we went over that in a kind of a broad overview, but I think each of them reference different examples of how David won his battles because of his trust in God, and when he took his attention off of that and tried to look at it from his own point of view, he made mistakes. I think seminary people are taught to have an application to what I call the "so what" in my teaching, and so what does all this mean to us? And to me, I think the context of this experience is that there's a reference in Psalm 44 and verse 3 that I'd like to quote to you in terms of perspective of this, and that is, it says, "For they did not gain possession of the land by their own sword, nor did their own arm save them, but it was your right hand, your arm, and the light of your countenance, because you favored them." So kind of goes back to that, if God's for you, who can be against you kind of deal. But I also like very much a statement I found from President Abraham Lincoln during the time of great conflict and battle in our nation, and maybe one of the most significant battles before our time today, where we're fighting physical enemies versus invisible enemies. But he made a very good point, I think, President Lincoln did, when he said, it's quite possible that God's purpose in this conflict is something different from the purpose of either party in their disagreements. So from my point of view, it's really a compelling reminder that we need to pray to God, seek His guidance on behalf of our actions and everything that we do. You know, the enemies in our life take many forms and shapes, but if God's with us, who can stand before us? And I really do hope that this lesson has been a blessing to you, and I would ask you to, be kind to others and be kind to yourself. And kind of as a conclusionary example of that, one of our buddies works with Danelle, a very fine young lady we like a lot, did a video where she put out, pretended to be talking to the administration of the school district where she works, and said, you got to open the schools. I can't be a teacher to my own kids. Let me be a teacher to somebody else's. And she happens to have 4 children all in the public schools at one time. And I wrote her a little something. I hope you get a kick out of it. I suggested to her there's an alternative educational process that we could offer, and I used all those fine teaching objective words and stuff that I've learned through the years. But I pretty much said, look, we can take them to the ranch and spray brush and dig out silted in water troughs, and they'll learn about soils and vegetation and insects and botany and wild hogs and mad cattle because they're thirsty, and they can get a little animal husbandry in. And it was pretty funny, and I suggested that, or it seemed funny to me anyway, I suggested what they could do is just, they didn't get it the first time, we'd take them through for free. And I already had 3 mamas call me and said, can I sign up my kids for your program? So I would ask you please to get out, enjoy yourself, reach out to others, show acts of kindness, and remember that God's in charge here. Who knows what's going to happen, but the battle belongs to the Lord. And I think maybe that Clint might even have that song a little bit later for you. So the value of this experience, I hope, was just to remind you that this ain't the first time God's children have been under conflict and stress, and we just look forward to seeing it end, and we wish you all safe and well-being. Thank you all for listening to me today.